The intent of this video is to provide an integration overview between ShareRefund's API, Stripe, and QuickBooks Online. ShareRefund is the most award-winning shipment auditing platform that saves businesses money on shipping. The winner of the 2016 Small Business App Showdown and the $100,000 cash prize, sponsored by Intuit. And included in ShareRefund, among all the great features, is the white label reseller program that allows businesses to offer shipment auditing as a value-add service, a branded service to their customers. So as we move forward, the assumption is that this video is targeting existing resellers with the interest of enabling the QuickBooks Online integration within their account. If you'd like more information on the reseller program or are curious about the program, the URL there will give you all the information you need to get started. So for today's video, the integration overview, what are we talking about? So all the parts inside of ShareRefund enable resellers to focus on selling with the intent of ShareRefund doing all of the back office work for our reseller customers. So the creation of invoices, the billing of credit cards, etc., is all automated. And for purposes of just providing a getting started, high-level view of what this integration includes, we're storing all debit and credit cards and processing them for reseller customers. Extending through QuickBooks Online, all of the relevant financial documents are created, updated, and matched in QuickBooks. The key one there is matched. So we're talking about sales documents, expense documents related to Stripe processing fees, etc. Matching all of those transactions to deposits and creating bank transfers where relevant. And we'll get into each one of those in more detail. One of the most exciting features about the integration is that ShareRefund supports multiple currencies. So using the features built into QuickBooks Online, several currencies are available to allow our resellers to operate in different countries. And ShareRefund does a lot of the heavy lifting to enable the accounting of being multinational. So if you are a reseller and you're curious on the integration, ready to get started, there is a short link that will take you to the support portal that was built for resellers, and there's a guide on how to get started. That's to be used in conjunction with this video, so please take a look at the guide and follow the instructions within to get your system set up for the integration. Once everything is set up, you can enable this service from inside your reseller dashboard within the settings on the left sidebar. That menu item, you'll see a card that looks similar to the card here on the right for QuickBooks Sync settings. And those fields within are what we need out of your QuickBooks account to write transactions, update transactions, etc. If you have a existing QuickBooks account up and running, this integration will work for you. The guide is more related to creating a new QuickBooks Online company. So if you have any questions, there's contact us methods at the bottom of that support portal, and definitely reach out to reseller support for more information. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about the typical accounting workflows, go into detail with all the transaction types that we mentioned before. And we're going to talk about the application of this integration, specifically what it enables resellers to accomplish, and outline some of the options for support in case you had questions about this integration. So the first step that we should probably take is just to identify some classes. So you'll see this icon. This is an example reseller company. And in this model, we're going to be creating invoices, emailing them to customers, and syncing those back into the reseller company's QuickBooks account. So Nick Goldberg below is the example customer. And you'll see these names reused and these icons used through this workflow. Just wanted to make a point here so that it helps us through our discovery. So first things first, simple sales documents. So sales invoices and sales receipts are the documents that we're talking about here. And so ShareRefund will create these documents for customers, reseller customers, according to the attributes of a given customer. So in this case, Nick Goldberg, there was an invoice generated. The status is currently unpaid. So how does this flow into QuickBooks? So right when the invoice is created, that information flows in near real time into QuickBooks. And if the customer Nick Goldberg did not exist, he will be created. And the sales invoice described will be created inside of QuickBooks as well. So you'll notice that there's no credit card on file. So since we're not taking payment at the time of transaction, it's a sales invoice. Pretty straightforward. Now onto sales receipt. This is generated when a customer's credit card is on file. And so we'll get into processing payment on both of these documents. But the point here is that the object of sales receipt is used to create a transaction for that customer. And so before that is routed into QuickBooks, we'll take the information stored on file and securely process a transaction using Stripe. And upon success, we will route the customer and the sales receipt document into QuickBooks in near real time. So showcasing that sales receipt transaction, you can see the transaction journal and the different accounts that were targeted with this transaction. And just as a side note here, these accounts you'll see inside of the setup document that was mentioned earlier, the Getting Started guide, and follow best practices for accounting and the use of QuickBooks. So here's another view of that same transaction for Nick Goldberg that was created. You'll notice the reference number of the payment ID provided by Stripe is routed into undeposited funds. Why undeposited funds? Because we haven't actually received a deposit from Stripe yet, and we'll get into that a little bit more. It's important to note that every piece of information that is relevant to the transaction is processed into QuickBooks. These are not summary transactions. The line items, the products, everything comes along through this integration. So it's ACID by nature, and all the important reference fields that would be needed to look up any given transaction inside of QuickBooks are passed through the API accordingly. So you notice that the payment method here was credit card, undeposited funds, and you see that same sales receipt number up on the top right. So how do we process payments through this integration? So we've seen this before when we created the, when a credit card was on file, we attempted payment, that was success. We generated a sales receipt, and you'll notice to the bottom below QuickBooks, we actually have a record of that payment that's flowing through the API into QuickBooks. So all of that information routes in near real time into QuickBooks through the integration. How about check payments? So as a reminder, our resellers collect the money. They are essentially running their own business, and in the case that a customer doesn't have a card on file and the sales document of type sales invoice is generated, and the customer prefers to pay by check or ACH, perhaps through a payables department, those checks are processed into ShareRefund, the reseller program by the reseller, and the record of that payment flows into their QuickBooks file. So on the edit view for any given invoice, you're going to find at the bottom a option to enter a payment, and you can specify the payment method. In this case, we would update from credit card to check or ACH, or however you would like to apply payment to that invoice. the amount, and the transaction ID. As soon as add payment is tapped, that information flows into QuickBooks. So just showing this in the diagram, the payment is recorded manually by the reseller user. And since there was no credit card on file, again, we're generating a sales invoice. And once that payment is entered, the payment will be updated to the existing sales invoice that was created inside of QuickBooks. And the clipboard over to the right signifies the record of the payment being attached to that sales invoice, updating the balance to 0. So, how are discounts handled through the API? A big part of the sales and marketing strategy for our resellers is to offer free trials. And so in the case of free trials, email templates are generated and passed to our resellers that can be used to incentivize prospects down the conversion funnel. And so if a customer clicks on this link and registers through that link, they'll receive a 30-day free trial or 15-day, whatever was provided by the reseller to that prospective customer. So how does it work out in the workflow? Very similarly to check or ACH payments. So in this model, the payment method is discount. The amount to be specified would be perhaps the whole invoice amount, or could also be a partial discount on that invoice. And all of these transactions, either through the free trial link inside of the email that generates invoices that are already pre-discounted, or through a post-discount to an open invoice method. In all cases, those discounts route to an account that is a contra revenue account following accounting best practices. And so going back to our typical model, if a sales invoice was generated and a payment of type discount was created, that information, as expected, flows into QuickBooks accordingly. And so here you can see the discount being applied to an open invoice, and you'll notice that the discount value in this particular case was the amount of the invoice total, $120.75. So with the application of that payment of type discount, the balance of that invoice was updated to 0. Just another view of that same transaction. Here you can see the transaction journal and the accounts that were touched by that API update. So here the product or service of type discount will map to an account of type discounts given. And we'll show that on the P&L here in just a moment. So here's an example of the P&L. You can see that that particular transaction mapped into the discounts given account, and you can see that that's summing for the period of the amount 8,000 and some change. Okay, so in the case of discounts, we said that there could be a partial discount. So a bigger picture, what about multiple payments? So here's a prime example of a discount that was applied to an invoice, and then the transaction on that invoice was billed to an American Express sometime later. So it looks like 20 days later. So decent invoice here. So the reseller has full control over applying discounts to open invoices. So in this case, we have 2 payments on 1 transaction. How does the integration handle it? Well, let's see. So if we have multiple payments, the reseller would process the payments inside of Share a Refund. Now, we had 1 sales invoice, so 2 payment records would be applied to that 1 invoice. And there's a lot of complexity around multiple payments on a single invoice. So the system handles it intelligently and also notifies the reseller via email, hey, you probably want to go check out this transaction just to make sure that it matches your reseller app and QuickBooks So we do take measures along the way to help our resellers, let's say, ferret out the more complex transactions and make sure that everything is reconciling properly. So with payments covered, let's keep on moving through the workflow and talk about deposits. So at this point, sales receipt, sales invoice has been generated. A payment has been applied to that sales invoice or sales receipt successfully. And Stripe is going to process those funds and release them in the form of a payout to the bank account on file. So in this case, we are using Chase. And as a reminder, up at the top, that we have Stripe, which is processing all credit card transactions. And then the circle to the right of Stripe represents the check payments or the ACH payments. These would be, say, manual deposits or alternate methods of deposit into the bank account, not through Stripe. So you have a lot of different ways that deposits are coming into your account. For us and most resellers, the transactions are occurring via credit card. So Stripe is the method that we want to automate because it represents the most significant share of transaction volume. Here's a curious part, is that when a deposit is made, those deposits are routed to undeposited funds, which is a holding account inside of QuickBooks for, let's say, an accountant to review transactions and decide which ones are eligible to be considered in QuickBooks and ultimately get reconciled. The unfortunate part about the undeposited funds account is it's not accessible through the API. So if we have a Stripe transaction that's deposited to undeposited funds, well, Share Refund can't see that deposit. There is a workaround though, and the workaround is that we create a bank rule. So this is a mechanism inside of QuickBooks that's available that allows transactions to be automatically added to QuickBooks. And you'll see the option down on the bottom that says automatically add to my books. So here we're focused on Stripe as money in, where the bank text contains Stripe Transfer CCD. And with enabling this bank rule, then the Stripe transactions will automatically be added to QuickBooks, enabling Share Refund to access those deposits through the API. Now, why do we want to access the deposits through the API? It comes down to the process of matching. So once Share Refund has access to a deposit, then that deposit can be auto-matched to payments that were made via Stripe, specifically customer payments that are represented in that deposit. So if Nick Goldberg had a transaction that ultimately ended up as a deposit in QuickBooks, commingled with all the other customers, John Smith, etc., Share Refund will match those payments to the deposit, a process that, let's say, conventionally has been done by hand via your favorite accountant, is now done programmatically, much faster and also much more accurate in the process. So we create the bank rule that enables matching of the payments to the deposit, which saves time. And just showing a view from inside of QuickBooks, you can see that the transaction from Nick Goldberg was selected as a payment to be included in the deposit that is showcased here. So that's the checking of the box, selecting that sales receipt is the matching that we're talking about. So on the sales receipt side, this is the Nick Goldberg transaction. You'll notice right under the name up at the top left that the deposit is linked on this sales receipt. And you'll notice on the bottom right that the total of the sales receipt and the amount received are essentially the same by way of the deposit that was generated and matched. In similar form, matching of expenses must occur. And this is a convention of Stripe that the fees are removed from the deposit that those fees are associated with the transaction amount. So if this transaction of $4, for instance, was processed, the Stripe fees in this particular case were 42 cents. So the deposit that the reseller would receive from Stripe in this case is 404 less 42. So as a result, an expense transaction of 42 cents would need to be created and billed from vendor of Stripe, and ShareRefund does that. So let's take a look at how this goes. So you'll notice that in a P&L, the cost of goods sold, Stripe payment processing fees of $25,000 automatically it gets added to the P&L through this integration, which is great. Resellers or accountants of resellers don't need to go in and create one summary of Stripe payments. We can actually match those to each deposit automatically. And we'll get into exactly how that goes. Just noting where that Stripe payment processing fee shows up on the P&L. So once the deposit is recognized, remember this is where Stripe makes a deposit to the bank, and then that deposit is synced into QuickBooks, and then that deposit is available through the bankroll via the API, and ShareRefund gets busy handling the process of generating files, updating the deposit, etc. So once that transaction, that deposit is available in QuickBooks and ShareRefund sees it, ShareRefund will take the next step of querying Stripe to get the processing fees associated with that deposit, and then subsequently creating an expense inside of QuickBooks matching the amount that Stripe charged on that particular transaction. So once that expense is created, then we can attach that expense to the deposit in the same way we attached the sales documents, sales invoices, sales receipts. And so here you'll see an example transaction mapping to a checking account. And at the bottom, there is a negative deposit from Stripe for the amount of the Stripe processing fees on that particular deposit. And so the account that's touched off of this one is Stripe payment processing fees of $6.57. So we covered deposits, expenses. Now there's another, let's say, part of this integration that is very valuable for scaling operations outside the borders, and that is managing currency, foreign currencies. So generally, customers want to pay in local currencies, and for the pricing model of gain share pricing, where the service is performance based, i.e., if a reseller saves a customer $100, or let's say 100 British pounds in this example, then if the service fee is, say, even split 50 pounds of that $100 savings, then the invoice needs to be generated in British pounds. Now, the customer, when he or she receives the British pounds invoice, will pay via British pounds. So ShareRefund facilitates all of this for resellers behind the scenes. And so if you look at this particular transaction for a UK customer of 1281, you'll see that the transaction was billed to a Visa in pounds. So it's good because the customer gets to pay in local currency, and ShareRefund will make sure that as a reseller, your funds route into your USD bank account. And so just showing some of the features inside of ShareRefund within the reseller dashboard for any given customer. If you go to Edit Customer, you will see billing options. This card allows you to specify the invoice currency. Now, by default, this invoice currency will be read out of the shipping accounts, but it can be overwritten manually as needed by a reseller. Now for the fun part. So using the services of Stripe, Stripe will convert that transaction into USD and apply a fee on that transaction. Typical processing fee, there's also a transfer fee built in there. But the point is that there's a pounds transaction that converts into USD. So how does this flow through QuickBooks? A sales receipt is created for the amount of the transaction. The same type of sales receipt or sales invoice that was created were it a local currency. So we still have all of the Stripe information, etc. But you'll notice one key bit that we are depositing these funds into a settlement account. So GBP Settle is a register that was created specifically for UK transaction types. And so all sales receipts that are created through the API for customers where the currency type is specified as GBP will be created in that particular currency. So looking deeper at the bank registers, you can see the different types that are shown here. So we have AOD Australia, CAD Canada, etc. And you'll notice that all of these registers are in fact 0. So these registers are used to hold sales receipts and sales invoices until deposits are made. And then once deposits are made, then bank transfers are used to route the funds into the typical checking account that's associated with your bank account, i.e. Chase or whomever you bank with. So just trying to exemplify that a little bit deeper. If we have a deposit from Stripe, right? So commingled inside of a single deposit would be currencies of all different types. So we had a sales invoice, sales receipt from the UK, from the US, etc. All those flow into QuickBooks, the checking account, as a single transaction in USD. So what do we do? Well, once we get that deposit, we're going to create a transfer of the same amount as the sales invoice or sales receipt that was billed to the customer that routed again to the currency specific bank register. And so once we create that transfer, then we can go back and match that transfer to the deposit that was created, the commingled deposit. In other words, what we're really trying to accomplish here is getting the bank deposit to match. So in our matching pursuit, we have the payments made by customers via sales documents, albeit a sales invoice or a sales receipt. We have processing fees via Stripe that are matched to that deposit. And then we have the reconciliation of foreign transactions into local currency via Stripe. And those bank transfers are subsequently matched to the bank deposit to get everything to match perfectly. So said simply, in this particular transaction, a bank transfer was generated at the exchange rate used by Stripe to process that transaction, and those funds will flow into this bank deposit as a matched transaction, getting everything to reconcile to the penny. So why do we care? What is the whole point of this integration? 0% was what we set out to achieve for the amount of time that resellers spend inside of QuickBooks. In other words, as a share refund reseller, you have access to all the same code that we use to automate much of our bookkeeping. And the intent is to keep you out of QuickBooks as much as possible. Let the software do its job. So that's the point of this integration. And with the high available system of share refund, another, let's say, engineering point was that we wanted zero downtime. So with APIs and distributed systems, we wanted to make sure that if an API was unavailable from Stripe or QuickBooks, whomever, that none of those transactions were lost. And so we queue all transactions and we operate in near real-time processing per the availability of those APIs at the time of the request. Most transactions happen within 100 milliseconds or less. It just really depends on those services. But for Share Refund, with the architecture of Amazon Web Services and leveraging all of the capabilities provided to us by Amazon, we're able to say we have 0% downtime on routing all transactions into QuickBooks. The other key is the accuracy of transactional data. So we took it out to 9 decimal places for the conversion amounts, transaction details, etc. So every transaction will be to the penny, across border transactions, etc. And for the resellers that beta this program, have rave success. So Jeremy Craig, a certified pro advisor, said stellar end-to-end integration for software as a service business model. And as a reseller, you now have access to this, and it's totally free. There's no cost to enable this feature inside of your reseller account. If you'd like to use QuickBooks as your accounting suite, which is what we recommend, you can enable this feature by following the guide that was presented previously, or you can reach out to reseller support using the email address provided there. If you have any questions, there's answers. There's a ton of information available within the support portal. That's support.sharerefund.com. And I appreciate your attention as we provided this overview video on the integration between Share Refund, Stripe, and QuickBooks. Thanks so much.